A dusty road stretched across the barren countryside, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows. A lone pickup truck rumbled along, its cargo bed filled with sacks of grain and farming supplies. To any passerby, it was an unremarkable sight, just a humble farmer making his way home. But as the vehicle approached a bend in the road, flashing red and blue lights suddenly appeared behind it. 3 uniformed officers stood beside their patrol car, waving the truck down. Their expressions were not those of duty-bound men enforcing the law. There was something else in their eyes. Greed. The farmer pulled over, stepping out slowly. His clothes were worn, his face weathered from years of hard labor. He looked like an easy target. One officer approached, pretending to inspect the truck. His gaze sharpened when he spotted something hidden beneath the sacks. A wad of cash, large, thick stacks bound tightly together. This was no ordinary farmer, and that was no ordinary cargo. A smirk played on the officer's lips. Well, what do we have here? John Reynolds remained silent, his expression calm. He knew what was coming next. He had seen this kind of corruption before, in places far worse than this rural highway. The difference was, those who had underestimated him in the past never got a second chance, because behind the quiet demeanor and tattered clothes was a man forged in fire, a former Delta Force commander, a master of survival and combat. The officers had just made the worst mistake of their lives. This story delivers high-intensity action, military strategy, and a thrilling conclusion. Subscribe now to make sure you don't miss a second of it. The sun dipped lower on the horizon as John Reynolds brought his truck to a stop. Dust swirled around him as he stepped out, his boots crunching against the gravel. His weathered hands rested at his sides, calm, controlled. 3 uniformed officers stood before him, their badges reflecting the dying sunlight. "License and registration," one of them demanded, his voice carrying the arrogance of a man who felt untouchable. John reached into his back pocket, pulling out his wallet with deliberate slowness. He knew better than to make sudden moves around men like these. The lead officer, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, snatched the documents from his hands, barely giving them a glance. "You out here alone, farmer?" another officer asked, circling the truck like a vulture. John didn't answer. He didn't need to. These men weren't here for small talk. They were here because they had already made up their minds about him. The third officer, younger but just as ruthless, climbed into the back of the truck, rummaging through the sacks of grain. Then he stilled. Well, he murmured, lifting a thick stack of cash from beneath the supplies. His grin was slow and predatory. "Looks like our friend here has been holding out on us." Scarface, clearly the leader, turned to John with mock surprise. "Have you got an explanation for this?" John held his gaze. "Sold some cattle, cash payment." The officers chuckled. The sound was anything but friendly. "That so?" Scarface tapped the bills against his palm. "See, problem is, that looks a lot like cartel money to me. And you know what happens to people caught moving cartel cash?" He let the question hang in the air before answering it himself. "We confiscate it. Simple as that." John remained still, his face unreadable. The younger officer stepped closer, tilting his head. "You don't seem too worried, old man." John met his gaze, his voice even. "Should I be?" Scarface laughed, low and humorless. "That depends. You can make this easy, hand over the cash and be on your way. Or," he took a step forward, lowering his voice, "we can make an example out of you." The third officer, still perched on the truck, rested his hand on his holster. The message was clear. John inhaled deeply. He had seen this kind of power play before, in war zones, in third world countries where authority meant control, and control meant taking whatever you wanted. But these officers had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw a farmer. They didn't see the man who had spent years hunting warlords in the dead of night. They didn't see the soldier who had survived ambushes in the desert and jungles, where hesitation meant death. They didn't see the predator they had just cornered. Scarface grabbed John's shoulder, shoving him backward. "Didn't you hear me, old man? I said—" John moved. Lightning fast, his calloused hands shot up, twisting Scarface's wrist outward with brutal precision. A sickening pop filled the air as the officer screamed, dropping the wad of cash. Before the other two could react, John drove his elbow into Scarface's ribs, sending him crumpling to the ground. The younger officer reached for his gun, but John was already there. A sharp strike to the wrist sent the weapon flying. A follow-up kick to the knee sent him sprawling. The third officer finally pulled his firearm, aiming it squarely at John. "Don't move!" he barked, panic lacing his voice. John didn't, not yet. The officer's hands trembled slightly. Rookie mistake. John's eyes flicked to the fallen officers, both groaning but conscious. He had seconds to act. With the precision of a trained warrior, John lunged. His fingers clamped around the gun's slide, pushing it out of alignment as the officer fired. The shot went wide, ringing through the empty road. Before the officer could react, John wrenched the gun away and slammed its butt into his temple. The officer collapsed. Silence followed. John stood among the unconscious bodies, breathing steady. The encounter had lasted mere seconds. He glanced down at the pile of cash now scattered across the dirt. He had come here as a farmer. These men had tried to make him a victim. Now they lay unconscious, and he disappeared into the night. The road was silent except for the faint rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. John Reynolds stood still, his breath even, his heartbeat steady. 3 corrupt officers lay sprawled around him, groaning in pain or knocked unconscious. He knew he had to move. Fast. John took a final glance at the scattered cash, then at the distant horizon. The sun had dipped lower, bathing the world in a deep orange glow. The darkness would be his ally. Without hesitation, he strode toward the nearest patrol car. He reached inside, yanking the radio from its slot. With precise movements, he removed the battery and tossed it into the nearby ditch. No calls for backup, no quick retaliation. Then, he turned to his truck. The engine roared to life as he pulled back onto the road, disappearing into the growing night. Hours later, John pulled into his secluded farm, parking beneath the shadows of a large oak tree. He cut the engine and sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel. His hands were steady as they always had been, but tonight, something stirred within him, something he had buried long ago. Violence. It had been years since he had last used his training, since he had last moved with the lethal precision of a Delta Force operative. He had sworn to leave that life behind, to trade warfare for the quiet existence of a farmer. But tonight had proven that the world wasn't done with him yet. He exhaled sharply and stepped out of the truck, his boots sinking into the soft dirt of his land. The farmhouse stood ahead, its porch light flickering dimly. It was home, a sanctuary, but he knew it wouldn't remain that way for long. The officers would come back, and when they did, they wouldn't come alone. John walked inside, locking the door behind him. He moved through the house with practiced efficiency, checking the windows, securing the blinds. His mind was already racing ahead, calculating, preparing. These men would want revenge. They would investigate. They would uncover who he was. And when they did, they would bring everything they had to destroy him. John sat at the kitchen table, pouring himself a glass of water. His reflection stared back at him from the window, tired eyes, a face marked by years of war. He took a slow sip, letting the coolness steady him. Then, without hesitation, he reached for the phone. There was only one person he could trust with what was coming. Someone from his past. Someone who would understand. He dialed a number he hadn't used in years. It rang twice before a gruff voice answered. "Didn't expect to hear from you, John. I need a favor," John said, his voice calm but firm. "They're coming for me." A pause. Then the voice on the other end simply replied, "I'll be there." John hung up, placing the phone down with quiet finality. His expression was unreadable. He wasn't running. If they were coming for him, he would be ready. The night was quiet, but John Reynolds' mind was anything but. He sat on the porch of his farmhouse, a single lantern casting a dim glow over the wooden planks beneath his boots. The air smelled of fresh earth and distant rain, but his thoughts drifted far from the tranquility of his land. They drifted back to another time, another life. Years ago, Delta Force selection. The air was thick with sweat and exhaustion. The dense jungle swallowed the sound of heavy breaths and shifting boots as a group of soldiers navigated through impossible terrain. They had been running for hours. No food, no rest, only the punishing weight of their packs and the relentless demands of their instructors. Among them, John moved like a shadow, his steps calculated, his mind sharp. He was younger then, leaner but already hardened by life. His eyes, even in youth, carried the same cold intensity they held now. "Reynolds!" a voice barked. A towering instructor loomed over him, eyes scanning for weakness. "You think you're special? That you're built for this?" John met the man's gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir," the instructor smirked, stepping closer. "Then prove it." Without warning, John was struck, hard. A test, a provocation. He didn't react with anger. nor did he stumble back. Instead, he absorbed the blow, steady as a mountain. He had learned long ago that hesitation meant failure. Pain meant nothing. Only the mission mattered. The instructor grinned, stepping back. "So you might just survive, Reynolds. Classified operations, the shadows of war." Years later, John found himself deep in enemy territory, leading teams through missions so dangerous they didn't exist on paper. The world only heard whispers of the wars he fought, the lives he took to protect countless others. One mission stood out among them all. A compound hidden in the mountains, housing a high-value target. The orders were clear: get in, neutralize, get out. John and his team moved like ghosts, slipping through the darkness, avoiding detection. They breached the facility with ruthless efficiency, silencers whispering death, bodies crumpling to the floor before alarms could sound. But the moment he pulled the trigger on the target, something inside him shifted. He saw the man's eyes widen in shock, not of pain, but of resignation. John had killed many before, but this one stayed with him. He had become a weapon, a tool for others to wield, and in that moment he knew it was time to walk away, leaving it all behind. John stood before his commanding officer, his resignation letter in hand. "You really think you can just leave this life, Reynolds?" the officer asked, voice laced with doubt. John nodded. "I've given enough." The officer studied him for a long moment before sighing. "Men like you don't get to retire. The world doesn't let you." John had simply walked out. He traded his rifle for a plow, combat for solitude. He built his farm with his own hands, determined to live out his days in peace. But deep down, he had always known. The past never stays buried. Back to the present. A distant rumble of thunder snapped John back to reality. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. The men he had taken down on that road wouldn't let this go. He knew their kind. They would regroup, recover, and retaliate. And when they did, they wouldn't find a helpless farmer waiting for them. They would find the man he used to be. John pushed himself up from the chair, stepping back inside. The fight was coming. It was inevitable. And he was ready. The fluorescent lights of the small-town police station buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the cluttered desks and faded paperwork. 3 officers sat in the dimly lit back room, nursing bruises, split lips, and wounded pride. Scarface, real name Captain Harris, pressed a cold pack against his swollen wrist, his jaw tight with anger. The other 2 officers, Matthews and Dorsey, sat across from him, exchanging uneasy glances. "This wasn't some random old man," Matthews muttered, his voice filled with frustration. "He took us apart like we were rookies." Dorsey, the youngest of the 3, clenched his fists. "We should have just shot him." Captain Harris shot him a glare. "That's exactly why we need to be smart about this." His voice was cold, measured. "He humiliated us, left us in the dirt like a bunch of amateurs. You think we can let that slide?" They fell silent. They knew what had to be done. Harris pulled his phone from his pocket and dialed a number. After a few rings, a voice answered. "I need men," Harris said, his fingers tightening around the phone. "Good ones, armed." A pause. "We're taking care of a problem." John's farm, midnight miles away. John Reynolds stood in his barn, his hands moving with quiet precision as he inspected his equipment. The wooden structure was lined with tools, ropes, and old hunting rifles. He had always kept a few weapons locked away, though he had never needed them, until now. The distant hoot of an owl echoed through the night as he adjusted the sights on his rifle. His instincts told him the truth. This wasn't over. Men like Harris didn't take a beating and walk away. John moved to the farmhouse, locking the doors and securing the windows. His land stretched for acres, mostly open fields with pockets of thick woods along the edges, plenty of space to set up defenses. His phone vibrated on the kitchen table. He picked it up and answered. "You were right," the voice on the other end said. It was the contact he had called earlier, a man from his past, one of the few he still trusted. "Harris is making moves. He's calling in guys who don't wear badges, mercenary types." John remained silent for a moment. Then he asked one question. "How long do I have?" "Maybe a day, maybe less." John nodded to himself. "Appreciate it." He hung up, his jaw tightening. They were coming. The officer's plan. Harris and his men sat in the back of a dimly lit bar, discussing their next move. "We're not going in as cops," Harris said. "No sirens, no backup from the department. Officially, this isn't happening." Matthews leaned in. "So what's the play?" Harris took a slow sip of his whiskey before answering. "We hit him at his farm. Late. No witnesses. No survivors." Dorsey smirked. "So we wipe him out and take whatever we want?" Harris nodded. "He made a mistake when he messed with us. We make sure no one ever hears from John Reynolds again." As the men clinked their glasses together, their fates had already been sealed. Because John wasn't just waiting, he was preparing. The wind howled through the fields, rustling the tall grass that surrounded John Reynolds' farmhouse. The night was thick with anticipation, the kind that only a seasoned warrior could sense. A storm was coming, not of rain or wind, but of violence. John moved with quiet efficiency, his hands working with a purpose honed by years of combat. He had spent the last few hours securing his land, transforming his peaceful farm into a battlefield, fortifying the farm. The first step was controlling access. The dirt road leading to the house was the only clear approach, too exposed for a direct assault. He cut thick wooden logs and arranged them strategically, blocking the main path while leaving a few deceptive openings. If they came in vehicles, they'd be forced to slow down or abandon their cars entirely. Next, he turned his attention to the barn. It was the perfect place for an ambush. He reinforced the wooden beams, making it seem like a safe structure to take cover in. But just beneath the haystacks, he placed makeshift traps, spiked boards, tripwires, and even a few strategically placed explosives he had kept locked away for emergencies. Inside the farmhouse, he positioned furniture as barriers, creating defensive angles. He knew every inch of this land, every blind spot, every place an enemy might try to use. This wasn't just a home. It was his territory, and he was turning it into a fortress. Arming for war, John pulled open an old wooden chest in his bedroom, revealing weapons that hadn't seen the light of day in years. A custom M4 carbine, a Glock 19, and a serrated combat knife, each a reminder of the life he had left behind. He inspected the rifle, its weight still familiar in his hands. He cleaned it, loaded fresh magazines, and strapped extra rounds to his belt. Then his phone rang. He picked up without hesitation. "You got a package outside," the voice said. John ended the call and stepped onto the porch. Parked just beyond the tree line was an unmarked black SUV. A man stood beside it, his face shadowed by the dim glow of a cigarette. "Been a long time, Reynolds," the man said, tossing a small duffel bag onto the ground. John crouched down, unzipping it. Inside was an arsenal, extra ammo, tactical gear, and a few more weapons, including a suppressed sniper rifle. "You always did like to be overprepared," John murmured. The man took a long drag of his cigarette. "And you always had a bad habit of attracting trouble." John zipped the bag shut. "Appreciate it." The man nodded. "They won't stop, John. You know that." John's eyes darkened. "I know." Without another word, the man turned and disappeared into the night, his SUV vanishing down the road. John carried the bag inside and set the sniper rifle by the window. He positioned it carefully, giving himself a clean shot of the main road. He wasn't planning to run. He was planning to end this. The final check. John stepped outside one last time, inhaling deeply. The air was crisp, the night silent. His farm, his home, was now a trap waiting to be sprung. He had done all he could. Now it was just a matter of time. He tightened his grip on his rifle and whispered to himself, "Come and get me." The night was deep and silent, the kind that carried a deceptive calm. John Reynolds stood in the darkness of his farmhouse, his eyes sharp, his breathing steady. He had spent hours preparing, and now the waiting was over. A low rumble in the distance made his muscles tense. Headlights appeared at the far end of the dirt road, one pair at first, then another. Soon a convoy of vehicles rolled toward his farm, their engines humming like an approaching storm. John exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around his rifle. They're here. The first trap. The lead SUV slowed as it approached the makeshift blockade John had set up. Inside, Captain Harris sat in the passenger seat, his fingers tapping impatiently against his knee. "What the hell is this?" the driver muttered, squinting through the windshield. The logs and debris John had scattered made it impossible to drive straight through. Harris smirked. "He's trying to slow us down." He grabbed his radio. "Get out and move the damn logs." "Keep your eyes open." Two men exited the vehicles, rifles at the ready. They approached the blockade cautiously, their boots crunching against the gravel. The moment they touched the logs, John flicked a small switch in his hand. A sharp explosion erupted from beneath the debris, sending dirt and shrapnel flying. The men were thrown backward, their bodies hitting the ground with dull thuds. Panic rippled through the convoy. "He's got traps," someone shouted. Harris cursed under his breath. "Fine, we do this the hard way." He turned to the rest of his men. "Ditch the cars, we go in on foot." Shadows and gunfire. John watched from his sniper's perch, his trained eyes tracking their movements. The men spread out, rifles raised, moving with cautious precision. Harris wasn't stupid. He knew John was waiting. Good. John lined up his first shot. He took a slow breath, steadying his aim. Then he squeezed the trigger. A sharp crack split the air. One of the men dropped instantly, his body crumpling into the grass. The others dove for cover. "He's in the house," someone shouted. Bullets tore through the night, shattering windows and punching holes through the farmhouse walls. John stayed low, moving quickly to another vantage point. He fired again. Another man down. Then he heard footsteps. Fast, heavy. They were coming. Inside the farmhouse, John slipped through the shadows of his home, his movements precise, controlled. He had the advantage here. Every creaky floorboard, every blind spot, he knew them all. The first intruder breached the back door, stepping inside cautiously. John struck fast. His combat knife flashed in the dim light as he grabbed the man from behind, driving the blade into his side. The soldier gasped, eyes wide with shock before he collapsed. John barely had time to move before another one came through the hallway, gun raised. A single shot from John's Glock silenced him. Gunfire erupted from outside as more men rushed toward the house. They weren't backing down. John reloaded, his heartbeat steady. He had faced worse odds before. He wasn't going to die here. Not tonight. The battle rages on outside. Harris crouched behind a tree, scanning the farmhouse. The bodies of his men littered the ground. "This bastard's playing games with us," Matthews muttered beside him. "We need to flush him out." Harris nodded. "Burn it." Matthews grinned. He pulled a Molotov cocktail from his bag, lit the rag, and hurled it toward the house. The glass shattered against the porch and flames erupted, licking at the wooden walls. Inside, John smelled the smoke before he saw the fire. They wanted to trap him. Fine. But they had made one fatal mistake. John Reynolds was not the prey. He was the hunter. Flames licked the walls of John Reynolds' farmhouse, casting flickering shadows across the battlefield that had once been his home. Smoke curled into the night sky, thick and suffocating. But John was already on the move. He darted through the house, keeping low as bullets shattered glass and splintered wood. The corrupt officers had surrounded him, closing in like wolves. They thought they had him cornered. They were wrong. John slipped out the back door, vanishing into the darkness just as the fire roared higher. He moved with the silence of a predator, weaving through the tall grass that bordered his land. He could see them now, Harris and his men, their faces set with grim determination. The remaining officers had taken cover behind their vehicles, waiting for him to make a move. John didn't wait. The hunt begins. The first officer never saw him coming. John emerged from the darkness, his combat knife flashing in the moonlight. He grabbed the man from behind, covering his mouth as he drove the blade deep into his ribs. A sharp inhale, then silence. John lowered him to the ground and disappeared once more. The others were getting nervous. "He's out here," one of them muttered, gripping his rifle tighter. "He's watching us." Harris narrowed his eyes, scanning the shadows. "Stay sharp, he's just one man." A shot rang out. Another officer dropped. "Damn it!" Harris spun toward the sound, his grip tightening around his gun. "Spread out! Find him!" John smirked from his vantage point. They were panicking. Good. One-on-one soon, only one remained. Captain Harris. John stepped into the open, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Harris turned, his face twisted in rage. "You think you've won?" Harris spat, raising his pistol. "You're a dead man, Reynolds." John tilted his head slightly. "You sure about that?" Harris fired. John was already moving. He lunged forward, striking Harris's wrist with brutal precision. The gun clattered to the ground. Before Harris could react, John drove his knee into the man's gut, sending him staggering backward. The two men circled each other now, both breathing heavily. Harris sneered. "You should have just handed over the money." John's eyes darkened. "You should have walked away." Harris swung wildly. John sidestepped, countering with a precise strike to the jaw. Harris stumbled but recovered quickly, pulling a knife from his belt. John watched him carefully. Harris was trained, but he was sloppy, too reliant on brute strength. John, on the other hand, was surgical. The fight was over before it truly began. Harris lunged, but John parried with ease. A swift twist, a crack of bone, and the knife clattered to the dirt. Harris gasped in pain, clutching his broken wrist. John grabbed him by the collar and slammed him against a tree. "It's over," John growled. Harris' eyes darted around, searching for an escape, but there was none. John pulled a small recording device from his pocket and held it up. "Everything you said back there, about framing me, about murdering me, it's all on tape." Harris's face drained of color. John tightened his grip. "You're done." Captain Harris's breath came in ragged gasps as John Reynolds tightened his grip on his collar, pressing him harder against the tree. The fire from the burning farmhouse crackled in the background, casting a sinister glow over the battlefield that had once been John's peaceful home. The once arrogant officer was now trembling, his broken wrist hanging limply by his side. John held up the small recording device, watching the realization of defeat sink into Harris's face. "You've got nothing," Harris spat, his voice shaky but defiant. "Who's gonna believe a nobody like you over a decorated officer?" John's expression didn't change. He simply pressed a button on the recorder. Harris's own voice played back, clear, undeniable. "We hit him at his farm, late, no witnesses, no survivors. This bastard's playing games with us, we need to flush him out. Burn it." The blood drained from Harris's face. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. John leaned in, his voice quiet but firm. "That's all I need." Harris's panic turned into fury. "Do you think this ends with me? Do you think the system will let you just walk away?" John didn't answer. He just let go. Harris collapsed to his knees, clutching his broken wrist, gasping in pain. The sound of approaching sirens broke the silence. Justice arrives. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the night as multiple police vehicles skidded onto the property. Armed officers poured out, their weapons drawn. But they weren't here for John. The moment they saw Harris on the ground, battered and broken, and the burning farmhouse behind him, their guns lowered. A tall, stern-faced officer stepped forward. Unlike Harris and his men, this one carried himself with authority, not arrogance. "John Reynolds," he called. John didn't move. "Who's asking?" The officer pulled out his badge. "Lieutenant Marshal. We received an anonymous tip about police corruption. We were sent these..." He held up his phone, playing the same recording John had captured from Harris. John glanced at the SUV parked near the tree line. His contact had come through after all. Marshal turned to Harris, who still sat in the dirt, eyes darting between the officers like a caged animal. "Captain Harris," Marshal said coldly, "you are under arrest for conspiracy, attempted murder, arson, and multiple counts of corruption. I suggest you don't make this harder than it already is." Harris started to protest, but the officers hauled him to his feet, snapping handcuffs around his wrists. The once powerful man was now nothing more than a disgraced criminal. John watched in silence as the rest of Harris's surviving men were rounded up, their weapons confiscated, their protests ignored. It was over. The aftermath hours later, the fire had been extinguished. The remains of John's farmhouse were nothing but charred rubble and smoke. He stood at the edge of his land, watching as the last police car drove away, taking Harris and his men with them. A familiar voice spoke behind him. "You're gonna need a new house." John turned to see his old contact standing there, arms crossed. John exhaled through his nose. "Yeah," his friend smirked. "You sticking around?" John looked at his land, his home. It was in ruins, but it was still his. And for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. "I think I'll stay," John said. "At least until the next storm rolls in." His contact nodded. "Something tells me this won't be the last time trouble comes knocking." John's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "No, it won't. The past never stayed buried, and neither did men like him." Smoke and ash drifted through the night as John Reynolds stepped away from Captain Harris, his heartbeat steady, despite the chaos around him. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood, the wreckage of his home glowing under the moonlight. Harris was on his knees, his face contorted in pain, his broken wrist hanging uselessly at his side. The once confident officer had become nothing more than a wounded animal, desperate, furious, and cornered. John studied him for a moment. He had seen this before. Men who thought they were invincible until the battlefield reminded them otherwise. But Harris wasn't done. Even with the fight beaten out of him, he still had one last trick up his sleeve. With a sudden burst of motion, he lunged, reaching for the knife tucked in his boot. He moved fast, faster than John had expected from a man so injured, but John was faster. The moment Harris's fingers wrapped around the knife handle, John's boot came down, hard, crushing the officer's hand into the dirt. Harris howled in pain, his fingers spasming as the blade clattered uselessly onto the ground. John crouched, his face inches from Harris's. His voice was low, steady, deadly. "Still think you're in control?" Harris's breathing was ragged, his rage flickering into something else, something close to fear. John grabbed the discarded knife and tossed it far into the field. "It's over." But Harris wasn't listening. His eyes darted around, still searching for a way out, still unwilling to accept the inevitable. John exhaled. He had seen men like Harris before, the kind who never stopped, never admitted defeat, until the grave forced them to. But he wasn't going to give Harris the satisfaction of dying in battle. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, a recorder. John pressed play. Harris's own voice echoed through the night. "We hit him at his farm, late, no witnesses, no survivors." "Burn it." Harris froze. His face paled as the weight of his own words came crashing down on him. John let the recording play out before pocketing the device. Then he stood, stepping back as the distant sound of sirens filled the night. "They're coming for you," John said, his voice calm. "Not as your backup, not as your boys, but as the law." Harris's lips curled into a snarl, but there was no fight left in him. He had lost. Part 2. The Truth Unveiled, 700 words. The flashing lights arrived soon after, painting the farm in streaks of red and blue. Officers swarmed the area, their radios crackling, their weapons drawn. But when they saw the scene before them, Harris on his knees, his men either dead or captured, John standing over him, their posture shifted. John didn't resist. He simply held up the recorder. "Everything you need is on this." Lieutenant Marshall, the officer in charge, took the device. He listened, his expression hardening with every passing second. When it finished, he nodded once. Then he turned to his men. "Arrest him." Harris let out a strangled sound as cuffs snapped around his wrists. "This is bullshit. You don't know what you're doing." Marshall ignored him. "Take the rest of them in too. Every last one." As Harris was dragged to his feet, John watched, his face unreadable. Justice had arrived. The aftermath hours passed. The chaos settled. The fire was extinguished. The bodies removed. The wounded taken away. John sat on the back of an ambulance, staring at what remained of his home. It was gone, burned to nothing but rubble and memory. A familiar voice broke the silence. "You did the right thing." John turned to see his old contact, his only real friend from his past life. The man stood beside him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. John exhaled. "Did I?" His friend smirked. "Harris and his men are going away for a long time. The town knows the truth. You got your justice." John nodded slowly. But deep down he knew this wasn't the end. The past had come knocking once, and it would come knocking again. As the first hint of dawn touched the sky, his phone vibrated. He pulled it out, glancing at the unknown number on the screen. He hesitated, just for a moment, before answering. A familiar voice spoke on the other end. "John, we need to talk." John closed his eyes briefly. So much for peace. He exhaled and responded with a single word. "When?" The town was quiet in the early hours of the morning. John Reynolds sat on the bed of an old pickup truck, his boots resting on the dusty ground, his rifle propped beside him. The remains of his farmhouse smoldered in the distance, blackened wood and ash the only things left of the quiet life he had built. But John wasn't thinking about the farm. He was thinking about the phone call, that voice, one he hadn't heard in years, a ghost from another life. "Are you still alive, Reynolds?" The voice had been casual, almost amused, but there was weight behind it, something unspoken. John had replied with only one word. "When?" "Soon," the voice had said. Then the line had gone dead. John exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders. He wasn't a man who believed in coincidences. He had barely finished burying one fight, and now another was already on the horizon. A familiar warning footsteps approached. John's old contact, his only real connection to the world he left behind, came to stand beside him. The man tossed a cigarette to the ground and crushed it under his boot. "You gonna answer that call when it comes?" he asked. John didn't look at him. Already did. His friend let out a dry chuckle. "Didn't take you for a man who liked unfinished business." John finally turned, his eyes calm but sharp. "Neither are they." A silence settled between them. His friend shook his head. "You can walk away, you know. Let this one go." John glanced at the remains of his home, at the field that had once been his sanctuary. "I tried that once," he murmured. His friend sighed. "Yeah. And look where it got you." John smirked, a hint of amusement in his otherwise hardened expression. "Right back where I belong." The next step. John reached into his pocket, pulling out the recording device he had used to bring Harris down. He turned it over in his hands, then placed it in his friend's palm. "Keep it," he said. "Insurance." His friend frowned. "Are you planning on making more enemies?" John shrugged. "No, but they're planning on making me one." The wind shifted, carrying the scent of charred wood and distant rain. A storm was coming, but John Reynolds had faced worse, and when the call came again, he wouldn't hesitate. He stood, grabbing his rifle, his expression unreadable. It wasn't over. Not yet. The first rays of morning light stretched across the horizon as John Reynolds stood at the edge of his ruined farm. Smoke still curled from the remains of his home, mixing with the crisp dawn air. It was over. At least this fight was. Harris and his men had been arrested, their corruption exposed for the entire town to see. Justice had been served, but at a cost. John had lost his home. The quiet life he had worked so hard to build reduced to ashes, but he was still standing. John ran a hand over his stubbled jaw, watching as the last police vehicles disappeared down the dirt road. His old contact leaned against a nearby truck, arms crossed. "So what now?" his friend asked. John didn't answer right away. He had come to this place to escape his past, to find peace in the simplicity of farm life. But deep down he had always known, men like him didn't get to retire. Not really. His phone buzzed again. That same unknown number. He had answered it once, and now there was no turning back. John sighed, slipping the phone into his pocket. "I rebuild," he said simply. "And when the next storm comes," he glanced at his friend, a knowing look in his eyes. "I'll be ready." His friend smirked. "You always are." John turned, walking toward what was left of his home. The past had found him once, and it would find him again. But the next time he wouldn't just be waiting, he would be hunting.